chapter 5 tonight. I don't have a particularly long lesson tonight, and this is a passage that I've preached on so many times that I'm going to find it hard to say anything tonight that I've not said many times before, and so I may just let you teach me or talk to me as we go along tonight. It's a passage that speaks about eldership. I will say that at first glance it seems almost a little bit out of place when you consider where we've been in our journey, right? Peter is writing to a group of people who are living and dying for their faith, and he's talking to them about how they're supposed to live in that kind of world, in the midst of a world where around every corner is danger, and there's people who are wanting to take your life simply because of what you believe. He's teaching them to live out the gospel and to be confident in the gospel and to love the gospel and to be mindful of the fact that this world is not our home. And I don't know, sometimes I think because we don't live in this type of day, we take for granted that this world is not our home. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Sometimes we forget, that I'm just a sojourner here. This is if I live 110 years, I hope not, but if I live 110 years, that's just a drop in the bucket. It's not even a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket that the drop in the bucket carries, right? I mean, it's so small in view of eternity. And yet, when you're going through difficult trials, I think you're more mindful of that because you realize life is fragile, and I'm gonna depart here, and I'm gonna go on, right? And I'm gonna have all of eternity in the presence of the one who died for me. But when life is going really well, it's kind of like, hey, I could stay here for a while, right? And we become those squatters that you can't get out of the rental apartment in this world, right? We camp out, we veg out, we make ourselves at home, and then all of a sudden, when the opportunity, when it's time to go, or we see other people go, it's almost like, well, I don't know, do I really want to go? There's so much here in life, and that's kind of the beauty and the ugliness of life when you think about it, because life some days is so elegant, and then other days it's so tragic, and it's just hard for us to really always view the world through eternal minds. And so that's really what Peter's focused on. He's tried to focus on getting these people to view the world from an eternal mindset, to see the world through the lens of the fact that it's passing, that it's temporal, and that it's not going to last forever. And then all of a sudden in the midst of that, he decides to preach a sermon to pastors, which doesn't seem to make any sense to me at all, because I think to myself, hey, listen, we're the good guys, okay? We're on your side, Peter. If you want to continue to tell these people what they're doing wrong, that's fine. I'll preach through that. But if you want to talk to me, why do it now? And the only reason I can come up with is because in such times, you need solid leadership. You need good eldership. You need great pastors. In fact, I'm going to go to the other side of it, and I'm going to say that in times like we live, we need those solid pastors, those good elderships, those good leaders, even more so to continue to draw us back to that eternal mindset. It doesn't do a pastor any good to feed into that cultural mindset that looks at this world and all that it has to offer as the best that you can hope for. And yet, that's where we see the common day preaching. My joke, I say it half jokingly but half serious, is that a famous pastor writes the book, Better You Now, right? And it's an instant classic. It sells 1 million copies. It's #1 Barnes and Noble. It's everywhere in Christian literature. And he writes 18 chapters about how to experience a better Christian life. And yet he fails to mention one time the cross of Jesus, the resurrection, or anything to do with the gospel whatsoever. And is there anything that was necessarily said that was wrong in the book? No, probably not. But if you don't talk about the cross, if you don't talk about the work of Christ, then how can anybody be better, right? But that's the world that we live in. a time when pastors don't really concern themselves as much anymore about preaching the good news of the gospel. It's more about preaching about situations or circumstances in life and so on and so forth. By the way, they talk about millennials all the time. That's the word that's thrown around, right? That's the age group that's just below me. The millennials are these group of people that everybody's trying to reach. If you're a politician, you're trying to get the millennial vote. If you're a pastor in a church, you're trying to get the millennials in your church. All these articles are always written about the millennials. And one of the things that studies have shown us is that millennials love projects and service projects. They're concerned with social justice. They're concerned with social order, which is great. You know, they like making sure that the hungry are fed. They're apt to give money to churches where they see their dollars actually transpiring into something, right? Whether it's mission trips to India or Mardi Gras or whatever it is. They like those things. They like to be hands-on and be able to touch things, and they love social justice and things like that. Well, why is that? And let me take it a step further. They don't like as much to be preached at. They like to have conversations. Why is that? You know, why is it that on the one hand they like social justice and they like fighting for causes, and on the other hand they don't like to be preached at? Well, the answer is not their fault necessarily. It's the product of what they've listened to, because popular preaching during their upbringing has been about those things, about social justice, about righting the wrongs, about dealing with poverty, all things that the church has an answer for, but all of it was stripped for 30 years away from the gospel. And so now we're seeing the product of that coming up. And we have to come back as people of the cross to the message of the cross. So in the midst of a people who are dying for their faith, Peter writes to eldership, and the only reason I can come up with him doing this is to say to the people, you need strong elders, you need strong leaders, and specifically to the elders who are ministering to these specific people. He wants to tell them, this is how God has called you to serve in the midst of all of this. Right? So, verse number 1. So I exhort the elders among you, excuse me, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. The first line is the first verse is very, very simple. Peter is saying, I'm an elder, and I'm writing very specifically to those who are your elders, those who are your pastors, who are your preachers, those who are serving you. He says, I exhort the elders, and that word exhort is a strong proclamation word. It's a word like he's saying, I'm telling you this is not optional, this is not something that you should think about doing, this is not something that you should give heavy consideration, but rather this is a command from me to do. I'm giving you the strongest language I can. I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder, and furthermore, as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, somebody who has seen Jesus suffer, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Verse number 2, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. One command there, broken down into two parts. He says that the elders among them are to shepherd the flock and they are also to exercise oversight. It's really one command or one job description, but it comes to us by way of two phrases. The word shepherd the flock is obviously an illustrative phrase that speaks of or points us to something that they could relate to. And by the way, shepherd is where we get our word pastor. But we know that pastor, bishop, overseer, and elder are used in the New Testament interchangeably to speak of the same role in the church. But he says that they are to shepherd the flock, and it's an illustrative way of describing what a pastor does. So in other words, put it in simple layman's terms, if I want to know what a pastor does, then I can go back and ask myself, what does a shepherd do? Well, what does a shepherd do? This isn't a trick question here. There's basically 4 responsibilities of a shepherd. Anybody? Feed. Okay. What else? Protect. What else? How about lead to pasture? Because pasture land dries up, right? And then the last thing, how about shear? We don't like it as much, but if you have sheep, they have to be sheared from time to time. You can't let that coat of wool grow too long. You know why you can't let it grow too long? Health reasons. Number 1, first and foremost, it leads to disease. Such things as mange, lice, parasites, as well as you protect what the sheep is producing. Wool, by its very nature, once it gets to a certain level on the sheep, begins to be less valuable. It begins to be less useful. And so they would shear it at the right moment to make sure that the wool was at its most usable or most valuable stage. Leading to pasture, that's not a hard one to figure out. They would take the sheep out to pasture. They would set up these temporary holding pens, and we've talked about those before, using rocks and sticks and thorns and thistles across the top to keep the wolves and the prey out. But after a while, pasture land dries up, right? Anybody that's got cattle knows this. So you got to move them to a different pasture land. So shepherd's got to do that. He also has to feed, which is similar to leading to pasture land, except for sometimes you have an obstinate sheep that refuses to eat to the land you take it. And so what do you have to do? You got to force feed it, right? And then you have protecting. Sometimes the shepherd has to shoot the wolves. He has to keep the wolves from coming into the places they're not supposed to be. So if that was true, then how could we correlate this to pasturing? If he's using an illustrated term, let me move these over a little bit. What would well now I can't remember what I erased. There we go. Let's start with the easy one. What would shearing look like? How about discipline? Right? What does leading look like? Showing the way, right? Giving vision. What? Example. That's right. Feeding, not tricky here. Where's that? Giving the word, that's right. And protecting. Can I just say shooting the wolves, because I like to do that? Shooting the wolves, shooting predators, right? Now think about this for a second. I don't want to belabor the point, but hopefully you won't be looking for a pastor search committee anytime soon. But when you've been a part of churches that have had to go through pastor search committees, what is the typical way the church goes about this? Just out of curiosity. Or what are some ways you've seen? Maybe I should put it like that. Let's be judgmental. Okay? What are some ways we've seen churches go about looking for their pastor? Collect resumes. What else? Go listen to them. Okay? So they want to capitalize here. What else? One thing that's common in some churches is they like to pass out surveys, and they say to all the sheep, "Hey, what are you looking for in a pastor?" Now, just for the sake of argument, what could be problematic with asking a bunch of sheep what they're looking for in a shepherd? Just out of curiosity, is there any possible problem in that? Yeah, absolutely, right? As my friend Dr. White says from the Lutheran Missouri Synod Church, he says the problem with sinful people is sinful people never know what they want. They never know what they need. when you turn to the sheep and you say, hey, tell us what you're looking for in a pastor, here's the normal job list that comes out, right? I'm looking for somebody who's going to be my friend. I'm looking for somebody that's going to come to all my hospital visits. I'm looking for somebody who's going to be, I don't know, you fill in the blanks, right? And we think on a very personal level about what that individual is going to do for us. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is sometimes we forget that there's 4 very clearly defined responsibilities or implied responsibilities that a pastor is given, and most of the time those are the ones that get overlooked. By the way, this is why I am so passionate about our church adopting that eldership model, because then you don't look at the sheep and say, tell us what you're looking for in this next lead elder or another elder. You're looking at other elders and saying, okay, you know what the job descriptions are, you know what the requirements are, you know what the vision of the church is. You tell us what we need, and you provide us somebody to consider. You give us that elder to look at, that shepherd to look at, and say, hey, this is what we need. Let me give you one example. Many years ago, many years ago, I was in college, and I wanted to get my feet wet in full-time vocational ministry, and so I was looking for an opportunity, and one of my professors recommended me for a youth pastor position there nearby Bolivar. And they wanted to interview me. They asked for my resume. I sent it in. They looked at it. They wanted to interview me. I went in. I interviewed. And, normally, anytime I'd ever done an interview for any kind of job, either I walked out with the job opportunity offer on the table, or within a day or two, I was getting a phone call, right? And so I didn't get any sense from them whatsoever when it was over with, and I thought, well, this is strange, What did I say wrong, A week went by and I didn't hear anything. 2 weeks went by and I got another phone call and they said, we'd like you to come and interview again. And I said, okay. So I came and I interviewed again. Same people. I gave the same answers to virtually the same questions. And we got to the end of it, and there was kind of some discussion, and finally I said, I didn't know at 20 you're not supposed to ask them questions, but I said, it seems like you guys are interested in me because you keep having me come back and talk to you, but there seems to be some hang-up. Can I ask you what the hang-up is? And they said, sure. They said, we're interviewing you and one other person, and we're all confident that you're the person for the job, except here's our job description, and there's 3 things on here that you don't meet. One was that I had not finished my education. One, I can't remember what it was. And the third one was that I wasn't married. And of course, I was arrogant, and I said, well, you couldn't have Jesus because he didn't have a Bachelor of Arts, nor was he married as your youth pastor. But it stuck with me after that. That they were doing what they were trained to do, right? And don't misunderstand me. Marriage is a good thing, and having a Bachelor of Arts is a great thing. But what was happening in that committee room was what is symptomatic of a lot of churches in the search for an elder. Or even after they get an elder, as they start thinking about what their expectations for that elder should be, they have in their mind this list, right, of personal attributes that are going to solve their problems. And the only thing I want to get at tonight is, let's make sure that when we do that list conforms to the scriptural list that is a responsibility of the pastor. In fact, I can remember John and Wilma may or may not remember this, but when I came in view of a call, they did a question and answer time, and somebody said, my former pastor was the kind of guy that when I walked through the door, he would come running over and give me a big hug, and I mean, he just made me feel like I was the only person in the church. Are you going to be that way? And I said, probably not. That's not me. I'm not the guy that runs across the auditorium to give you all the attention. That's just not me. I'm the attention, okay? And so I'm not that one. I didn't really say that second part, but I said, probably not. I said, that's just not my personality. That's not the way that God made me. Here's what I can promise you, And then I went through what I felt like was the most important aspects of being a pastor. I'll be there when your family needs me to the best of my ability. Unless my family has a need, I'll be there for yours, right? I'll preach the word with as much faithfulness as I can. I mean, I will do everything within my power to deliver to you what God has given to me, and I went through the list. When we look for elders, whether it's a youth pastor, a music pastor, a senior pastor, we need to make sure that they conform to the job description that the Bible gives and not one that we draw up for ourselves. Okay? This is then given to us in a second phrase. It's the same job description, but that is to exercise oversight. This is a little bit simpler in that it's not illustrative. It's very plain and clear, black and white. Exercise means to practice, right? And oversight means rule. It means to govern. It's one who rules or governs over. So Peter says to the pastors, in the midst of their trying to pastor a church who's going through great suffering and trial and tragedy, he says, I've got one thing to say to you. Shepherd the flock and exercise oversight. Right? Practice judgment, practice rule, practice governance. You are to watch over these that have been given to you. Now the best part about that is he gives us a description or qualifications of what judgment, what shepherding should look like. Or in other words, he defines what those things should be. And I'm going to go quickly over them. He says that we are to exercise oversight not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you. He's speaking about an elder's willingness or desire to exercise oversight. In other words, what he's saying to the elder here is, you don't exercise oversight out of fear of God or because you know you have to do it, but exercise oversight willingly. Do it because you have joy in it, because you want to do it, because you have a love affair in doing it, right? But willingly, and he says, as God would have you. God wants that elder to be joyful about what he's doing, about that exercising of oversight. Now, you play a part in that, don't you? The church plays a part in whether or not the pastor, the eldership, can exercise oversight willingly. Because, as my pastor used to say, all the time he'd say, sometimes you got to do the right thing because it's just the right thing to do. And he's right about that. Sometimes you get up in the morning as a pastor and you say, I'm going to do this, not because I want to, not because I desire to, but because it's just the right thing to do. I'm going to go do it, right? But here's the deal. Some churches make that more of a rule than an exception on their pastor. And others allow their pastors and their eldership to exercise oversight with joy. What's the difference between the two? Which are the churches that make those elders do the right thing because they have to? They know they have to because God's watching, as opposed to those churches that allow their eldership to exercise that oversight willingly. What's the difference between them? What do you think? That's it? What do you got? Anybody? This is, yeah, that's right.
They want to do it, or they're being forced to. They look at it as more of a job.
Okay, so but how does a congregation play into that? How does a congregation make it more conducive for that pastor to love on them, love what they're doing? How does...
You got to show up.
Yeah, okay, very good. All right. So, in using that example, I could go back to the gentleman and say, instead of, hey, wondering whether or not I'm going to run across the auditorium and wrap my arms around you and let you know you're the only person in the congregation, why weren't you running across the auditorium to your pastor and giving him a hug and letting him know how thankful you are for him? By the way, is there a way for this not to sound self-serving tonight as I work through this? Absolutely not. And I get that. I'm trusting you know my heart, okay? It's difficult for the preacher to talk about being a preacher because there's no way for it to come out perfectly. My point with that is absolutely. Congregations that love their pastors, love on their pastors. And I'm not talking about the things that, of money and all that. That's great. And listen, God has been so good through the faithfulness of His people over the years to take care of my family. I don't want to disregard that in any way, but how many times it meant a lot when I got a text in the morning that said, "Hey, I'm thinking of you today. I just want you to know that I was thinking of you." Or a simple card in the mail that said, "I appreciate what you do. I appreciate the fact that you came to the hospital. You must have been tired, you know." This year, my birthday came along, and most of you all are pretty faithful folks, and you let me know at some point, whether a text message or Facebook or whatever. But you know what the greatest card I got from? I got a card from a non-believer up at the school who sent me a card and said, "Hey, I just wanted to take a second and write you a personal note, tell you happy birthday. You've meant a lot to me in my life in the last 2 years, and keep up the good work." That meant more to me than anything else I got for my birthday. I mean, don't tell Kelly that, because she'll want some of it back. But that meant a lot to me, just to be appreciated. And I'm in a great church, but I know I have friends who are pastors that have pastored for 10 years in their church and never had a pastor appreciation gift. Have never gotten a thank you. Have never had, when they stood at the door at the end of the service, have never had a church member walk by and say, "You preached a really good message this morning." It's a real struggle for many pastors. And the best way a church can make a pastor enjoy his ministry, and by the way, which will make him more effective, is if they love him. They give him the courtesy that he, if he's a man of God, is trying to give to them.
Everything's got to be reciprocal.
That's right.
So it's the response of the church body to the leadership.
Yeah, I think in part, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, men that lead a church that have a heart for growth, for vision, people are going to buy into that like they would any other business or endeavor.
Yeah. You know, and I'll use Jason as an example. You know, I mean, they got some honey probably 4 or 5 months ago. I don't remember now. Right after they came, and I just made a flippant comment. I said, "Oh, you know, we love honey in our house." Next thing I know, he shows up at church with two jars of honey. You know, those types of things mean a lot to the pastor and their family, more than you'll ever realize. And not just the senior pastor, but across the board. Listen, I'm going to go on. I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second. I was number 2 chair for 6 years before I ever came to Cornerstone and was a senior pastor. It can be very debilitating at times in ministry. It's not supposed to, and I get that. But to be the youth pastor and not get any credit, not get people walking up and saying, "Hey, thank you. You know, you've done a good job. You've meant a lot." To be the music guy and to only hear when the soundboard messed up. You know what I mean? To be whoever it is, the worship leader or the women's leader. To not have a group of people appreciate and let them know. I've said 1,000 times that as a senior pastor, I get more credit than I deserve, and I get more criticism than I deserve. It's just part of the responsibility. But the congregation can make this easier on its eldership to love what they are doing when you love them, when you reciprocate. And by the way, those churches do have good elders, good pastors. There's bad apples out there. I know that. I know that. But on the whole, most of these men are good men. They really are. They maybe shouldn't be pastoring, but they're good men, you know. They have a heart for people, and that's why they got into it, right? At the job fair in high school, they didn't say, "Hey, those of you who want to be rich, come over here and sign up for being a pastor," right? And that's how we got here. They didn't say, "Those of you who want to be popular the rest of your life, sign up over here." The way a pastor loves what he's doing is if he keeps his central focus on Christ. But how you can help in that process is by letting them know, your eldership know along the way, "Hey, we appreciate, we notice when you went the extra mile," right? Not when the pastor texts you on Sunday morning and asks how church was and you say, oh, you did fine, and he wasn't there. He was sick with the flu, all right? That is not a good, appropriate response. He goes on, he says also that we should exercise this oversight not only willfully, but then he gets to the more sinister sides of things, and he says, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Here's the reality. There are some pastors out there that are pastoring for shameful gain, right? They're doing it because it can be a powerful position. It can have a lot of influence over people's lives. It can, in certain circumstances, lead to wealth, right? There are those who are sinister out there. Peter says to these elders, don't be those, okay? Don't exercise oversight for shameful gain. In other words, when we make decisions as a church, or as an eldership, when we try to lead our people into decisions, when we cast these visions, those visions should not be those visions should not look for our personal preferences and priorities first, but rather for the personal preferences of Christ first. In other words, when we cast a vision as a church, when I try to lead a church, one of the challenges that is in front of me is to get out of my own way, to get out of my own personal soapboxes, to get out of my own personal desires, and to make sure what I'm trying to lead a group of people into is actually the desire of Christ, right? That it's the right thing. Sometimes that's harder, even when you're trying to be sincere about it. Sometimes it's harder, because we naturally believe that what we want, if we are living a godly life, is also what God wants, right? I think I'm right about this. Y'all are looking at me like I am crazy, but I think I'm right about this. In my personal life, I can spend all the time in prayer. I can be studying the Word. I can be devoted to Christ. I can be seeking Him above everything else. And I can still at times get in my own way. I can still at times get blinded by my own personal project over what is actually good in the church. And that's the challenge. Peter says, exercise oversight willingly, but also do it eagerly, not for shameful gain. Do the right thing because it's the right thing. Then he says, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples of the flock. And this is the one that all the church members say, amen, right? We have been trying to get our pastor to do this, right? Because everyone's in agreement that the pastor shouldn't rule with an iron fist, that he ought to be an example. Now, the problem with that is sometimes we feel like we are being the example and you're not listening, right? So that's when the iron fist wants to come out. But in fairness, Peter says that that's not how you're supposed to do it. In other words, I'm not supposed to try to break Jim's back to make him come where I want him to come. And in this manner, I think it's a little bit like parenting. Now, I know that gets me in trouble because most of my congregation is older than I am, but it's a little bit like parenting. And I like what James Dobson once said about parenting. He said, the trick to parenting is to break the will without breaking the spirit. You got to break your child's selfish, sinful will to go the wrong way, but you can't break the spirit. And the only way I know how to define that, or to give that to you by way of an illustration, is I've seen in the bird dog world these days, because that's what I'm now into, right? Dogs that have been so zapped so many times by shock collars, have been treated so inhumanely when they would not do what they want them to do. You can now go out on a trial with them and you can make that dog do everything it's supposed to do, but it'll do it and it'll have its tail down and its eyes look like all the life has gone out from it, right? On the other hand, you can still use some of those techniques, but use them restrained only when necessary, and teach a dog to do what it's supposed to do and see the life and joy that it brings every time it gets the opportunity to bring that bird back to you, right? The guy who's trained me to train my dog, he says, listen, you got to understand, you are only a part of the dog's process, right? The dog does not understand that he needs you. You just have to insert yourself into his process and get him to do what you want him to do while believing that he's doing what he wants to do, right? That's pastoring. Sometimes it would be easier with shock collars, but you have to lead people by showing an example in front of them, but also without breaking their spirit along the way, without getting them to a point where they're only doing it because the pastor said it needed to be done, right? Where they're doing it because they want to do it, and there's life, and there's joy in their heart. And listen, many pastors have abused that pulpit that they've been given. They've abused that power that they've been given, and they've broken the spirit of the people. And listen, eventually that comes back. It always does. So Peter says to these men, you got to exercise oversight, but don't do it like Stalin. Don't crush out the life of the church in the process. Do it because you love doing it. Do it eagerly, not for shameful gain. And doing it by being an example to the people that you're trying to lead. Show them which way to go. By the way, this should give freedom to pastors, I think. Because if you lead by example and the people won't follow, that's not on you. Right? I just had this conversation with a pastor today at lunch who's really downtrodden about his ministry and the way some folks are kind of treating him. And I said, listen, man, it's okay to walk away. It's okay. You have given it over 20 years of your life. You have done your best to lead, and after over 20 years, they still don't want to follow. That means that either you are going in the wrong direction, or they are people who will not follow. And if in either case, you are the link that's joining it all together. Right? Now, I'm saying this passionately tonight. It's not always that easy. It's just not. Because here's the deal. I'll get really passionate about something, and I don't understand why Jim and Eunice aren't. And I don't understand why no matter what I say to them, they refuse to get passionate about it. Right? And so what my natural inclination is to do is to get up in the pulpit and say, listen, I know 98% of you are on board with me, but these two jugheads over here refuse to listen to reason. And they won't join me, right? Or the list goes on, or to use the pulpit as a bully to try to get folks to do what I want them to do. That's not how Peter wanted his elders to lead. Let me go back to verse 1 again. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder. As Peter said these words, he knew out of personal experience what he was talking about. He knew out of personal experience because he had been a stubborn sheep, but also he had been an elder. He was an elder. And he knew what it was like to get people to come with him. He knew what it was like when people refused to come with him. And so he writes to these elders to say, listen guys, I'm one of you. I am with you. By the way, if we put this back in its context for a little while, you would think when things are really tragic, when things are really difficult, that would be a time when the church would look at its pastor and go, hey, listen, we don't know what to do. Whichever way you go, we're going to go with you. But you know, the reality is sometimes that's not the way it works. And I think Peter knew that. And that might be part of the reason why he adds it into this section of conversation. Because these people are all trying to come up with solutions about what to do. And there's nothing worse than having too many chiefs in the kitchen. And so he was saying to the elders, this is how you need to lead them through this. And by telling the elders how to do this, by the way, he was telling the people, you need to trust these guys. God put them here for a reason. Even if you don't always agree, you need to trust them. I've said this, and I'll say it tonight as kind of an addendum to all of that, and that is that in our culture, in our Christian culture today, our church members want to know everything about everything, right? We have to know every last stinking detail. And if we don't about anything, then that means that somebody's trying to hide something, right? We are so paranoid. But the reality is, and folks, we are blessed here. God has given us a group of elders that we can trust. And sometimes when you don't know everything, you should know one thing, and that is that you should know the heart of your elders enough to say, I don't have to know everything, I'm going to trust them this time. right? I don't know everything, but I'll trust him. Let me go on just a little bit more. Verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Underline that. It's the greatest verse in all the Bible. One day I'm going to get a crown you guys aren't going to get. Verse number 5. So when you're hanging with me, verse 5. Likewise, you who are younger. By the way, the word he uses here could speak of age, but more than likely in its context he's speaking of the congregation now, right? Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. One thing I don't want in life is I don't want to be opposed by God. I think I can deal with opposition from almost every place except for God, from God himself. And Peter says God will oppose the proud, but he'll give grace to them. All right, so what are we going to commit to tonight? Let me write these things down so you don't get away, right? Give me your thoughts. Additions or corrections. Okay. Because and so that you know that it's not meant to be self-serving in any way. I think I might have told Eunice about this a few weeks ago. When was Joe Perush's funeral? You remember? Was that February? February. Back in February, we had a visiting family that came with a member family of ours, and they wanted to sit down and have lunch. And this young man was considering the ministry. He'd been considering it for a lot of years, and he was thinking about making a major step, leaving his career and getting into the ministry. And after services, we all went out to lunch, and he wanted to ask me some questions. And we're sitting there, and he says, I got to ask you something. He says, by the way you preach, I'm guessing you get a lot of letters. And what he meant by that was those letters that you don't like, right? The letters of, hey, that was really offensive, you shouldn't have said that, so on and so forth. And I said, actually, no. Amazingly, not very many. I said, apparently I'm good enough that I don't get the letter, they just don't come back. I don't know, or something along those lines. I was being a little bit facetious. But he said, really, you don't get any? And I said, no. And he says, well, I'm guessing you probably have some pretty tough business or deacons meetings. And I said, actually, no, not that many. And he says, well, you probably have some difficult business meetings along the way over 7 years, right? Actually, no, not that many now that you think about it, right? You know. And he says, well, what is tough about your church? And I said to him, I have to tell you, I'm the most blessed pastor in the world, sincerely. I pastor the greatest people who love Jesus, love their pastors, love their eldership, would do anything for them, support them. Are there a few bad apples? Not on Wednesday nights, but yes, you know. But I said, honestly, I don't deal with that like many others do. Folks, I've said this before, we love you. All the elders that you have here love you, and you make it a blessing. But this is still part of the process that we have to talk about, because one day it may be